For more than 3 centuries, the Spanish Empire stood as one of the most powerful forces on Earth. Its flag flew across continents, from the deserts of northern Mexico to the jungles of South America, from Caribbean islands to distant Pacific outposts. Spain ruled an empire so vast that, at its peak, it stretched across half the globe. For generations, Spanish ships carried silver, sugar, tobacco, and treasure across the oceans. Colonial cities thrived under imperial authority, and Madrid believed its power in the Americas would last forever. But empires rarely fall all at once. They erode, slowly, then suddenly. By the late 1800s, the once mighty Spanish Empire was no longer the unstoppable force it had once been. Revolution after revolution had shattered its hold over the New World. Mexico was gone. Most of South America was gone. Central America had broken away. What remained of Spain's empire in the Americas was just a handful of territories. Among them, one jewel stood above the rest: Cuba. To Spain, Cuba wasn't simply another colony. It was the empire's richest possession in the Western Hemisphere, a sugar-producing powerhouse and a critical trading hub in the Caribbean. Spanish politicians often spoke about the island as if it were not a colony at all, but an extension of Spain itself. And they meant it. Spain's Prime Minister, Antonio Cánovas del Castillo, once declared that Spain would sacrifice its last coin and its last drop of blood before surrendering even a single piece of its territory. But while Spanish leaders clung to imperial pride, the people of Cuba saw things very differently. For many Cubans, Spanish rule meant economic exploitation, political repression, and a future controlled by a distant European monarchy. By the mid-19th century, the desire for independence had begun to spread across the island like wildfire. And in 1868, that tension finally exploded. A wealthy plantation owner named Carlos Manuel de Céspedes made a decision that would change Cuban history forever. He freed his slaves. Then he declared Cuba independent from Spain. With that single act, Céspedes ignited a war that would rage for 10 brutal years. The conflict became known as the 10 Years' War, a bitter and exhausting struggle between Cuban revolutionaries and Spanish imperial forces. Fighting spread across the island. Plantations burned. Guerrilla fighters ambushed Spanish troops. Entire towns were pulled into the chaos of rebellion. For a decade, Cuba became a battlefield. But by 1878, the war ended without the independence the rebels had hoped for. Spain offered reforms. Some freedoms were granted. A constitution was promised. But the revolutionaries knew the truth. They had not won. They had only paused. Just 1 year later, rebellion erupted again in what became known as the Little War. This second uprising was smaller, weaker, and poorly supplied. Without the support and organization of the earlier rebellion, Cuban fighters struggled to sustain the conflict. Within a year, the revolution collapsed. To Spain, the rebellion seemed finished. But beneath the surface, something far more dangerous was building. Because the Cuban dream of independence had not died. It had only been waiting for the right moment. And when that moment arrived in 1895, the island would ignite once again. This time, in a revolution that would pull an unexpected superpower into the conflict. A rising nation across the Gulf of Mexico, the United States of America. By the 1890s, Cuba was a powder keg. Decades of frustration had built into something far more powerful than isolated rebellions. Across the island, intellectuals, farmers, laborers, and former revolutionaries were quietly preparing for another fight. But this time, the revolution would be different. It would be organized, disciplined, and far more determined. At the center of this movement stood a man whose influence would shape the entire independence struggle, José Martí. Martí was not a general. He was a poet, a journalist, and a political thinker who believed that Cuba's freedom had to come not just from rebellion, but from unity. He traveled across the Americas rallying support, gathering funds, and building a movement that could finally break Spain's grip on the island. Marty understood something many earlier revolutionaries had not. To defeat a global empire, the Cuban Revolution could not be chaotic. It had to be strategic. In 1895, that strategy was put into action. Across Cuba, coordinated uprisings erupted almost simultaneously. Rebel forces launched attacks in multiple provinces, catching Spanish authorities off guard. The revolution had begun again. But this time, the rebels carried a new political vision, one outlined in a document known as the Manifesto of Monte Cristi. The manifesto laid out the principles of the revolution in clear terms. Black and white Cubans would fight side by side. Private property would be protected whenever possible, and Spanish civilians living on the island would not be targeted simply for their nationality. The goal was independence, not revenge. For Spain, however, the uprising was an immediate crisis. The rebels, known as the Mambises, quickly proved they were far more organized than in previous revolutions. Thousands joined their ranks. Rural fighters mounted lightning-fast cavalry raids. Guerrilla units vanished into jungles and sugar fields. Spanish supply lines were ambushed, harassed, and looted. Within months, entire towns had fallen under rebel control. But despite their momentum, the revolutionaries faced a major problem: weapons. After earlier uprisings, Spain had imposed strict controls on firearms across the island. Owning weapons had been restricted, making it extremely difficult for rebels to arm themselves. The solution seemed obvious: smuggle weapons in from abroad. And there was one country where sympathy for the Cuban cause was growing stronger every day: the United States. American newspapers frequently reported on Spain's harsh rule in Cuba, and many Americans admired the rebels' fight for independence. But international neutrality laws complicated matters. Officially, the United States government could not openly support the Cuban rebellion. That didn't stop people from trying. Over the course of the early war, more than 60 ships loaded with weapons, ammunition, and volunteers departed American ports headed toward Cuba. Only one made it through. Some were intercepted by Spanish naval patrols. Others crashed at sea. And more than 20 were stopped by American authorities before they even left port, enforcing neutrality laws that technically forbade assisting either side. As a result, the Mambises had to rely on ingenuity. Instead of rifles, many carried machetes. Instead of conventional tactics, they used speed, ambushes, and surprise attacks. Horsemen would charge Spanish formations with blades flashing in the sunlight. Guerrilla fighters would melt into forests after striking supply convoys. It was brutal and surprisingly effective. Spanish forces began suffering heavy losses. Month after month, soldiers were killed in ambushes or disappeared in the countryside. By 1896, rebel forces had broken through Spanish defensive lines and begun surrounding major cities across the island. The revolution was gaining ground, but Spain was about to respond with a strategy so ruthless that it would shock the world and ignite international outrage. In early 1896, Spain made a decision that would permanently change the course of the war in Cuba. Madrid sent a new commander to the island, General Valeriano Weyler. Weyler arrived with one clear mission: crush the rebellion by any means necessary. Unlike previous Spanish commanders, Weyler had little interest in winning hearts or restoring order through compromise. His strategy was based on a simple calculation. If the rebels depended on the countryside for support, then the countryside had to disappear. In October of 1896, Weyler issued a sweeping order that stunned the island. Every civilian living in rural areas was required to abandon their homes immediately and relocate to fortified towns controlled by Spanish troops. Entire farming communities were forced to pack up what little they could carry and march toward overcrowded urban centers. Those who stayed behind were considered rebels. Their homes were burned, their farms destroyed, their livestock seized. The goal was to isolate Cuban fighters from food, shelter, and local support. If civilians were confined to cities, the rebels would be left alone in an empty countryside. But the policy created a humanitarian catastrophe. Hundreds of thousands of civilians flooded into fortified towns that were completely unprepared to house them. Food quickly became scarce. Sanitation collapsed. Disease spread through cramped refugee camps that resembled something closer to prisons than towns. Malnutrition, starvation, and illness devastated the population. Historians estimate that as many as 170,000 civilians died under whalers' reconcentration policy. For Cuban families trapped inside these camps, daily life became a struggle just to survive. And while the tragedy unfolded in Cuba, thousands of miles away another force was watching closely. The American press. Newspapers across the United States had already been covering the Cuban rebellion with growing interest. Stories of heroic rebels fighting a European empire captured the imagination of American readers. But reports of civilian suffering took things to a whole new level. Day after day, headlines described the horrors unfolding under Spanish rule. Starving families, burned villages, mass deaths inside overcrowded camps. Many of these stories were accurate, others were exaggerated, some were completely fabricated. This style of reporting soon became known as yellow journalism. Publishers like William Randolph Hearst and Joseph Pulitzer competed fiercely for readers, and dramatic headlines sold papers. Stories of Spanish cruelty dominated front pages. Illustrations depicted soldiers brutalizing civilians. Articles demanded that America step in and stop the suffering. Whether entirely factual or not, the effect was undeniable. Public sympathy for the Cuban rebels exploded across the United States. In cities like New York, millions of newspapers were printed every single day. Nearly every American household was reading stories about Cuba. And as the reports grew more dramatic, public opinion began to shift. Many Americans started asking a simple question: if the United States truly believed in freedom and democracy, how could it stand by while Spain crushed a revolution just 90 miles off its shores? But inside the White House, the situation looked far more complicated. President William McKinley understood that war with Spain could be unpredictable and dangerous. The United States had only recently emerged from its own internal conflicts after the Civil War. The country was still rebuilding its economy and military strength. McKinley wanted to avoid war if possible, yet events were about to spiral beyond anyone's control, because in early 1898, a single explosion in Havana Harbor would ignite a wave of outrage so powerful that diplomacy would no longer be enough to stop what came next. In January of 1898, tensions in Cuba reached a boiling point. Violent riots erupted in Havana, the island's capital. Spanish loyalists, furious over political reforms being discussed in Madrid, poured into the streets. Shops were smashed. Government buildings were attacked. And in the chaos, American citizens living in the city suddenly found themselves caught in the middle of a rapidly escalating crisis. The United States had significant economic interests in Cuba. American businessmen owned sugar plantations, shipping companies operated in Cuban ports, and thousands of U.S. citizens lived or worked on the island. Washington could not ignore the danger, so President William McKinley authorized the deployment of a U.S. Navy warship to Havana Harbor. Officially, the mission was peaceful. The ship was meant to protect American citizens and signal that the United States was watching the situation closely. The vessel chosen for the assignment was an armored cruiser known as the USS Maine. Commanded by Captain Charles Sigsbee, the ship carried a crew of 355 officers and sailors. When the Maine steamed into Havana Harbor on January 25, 1898, Spanish authorities did not object. The United States was still neutral in the Cuban conflict. The ship's presence was meant to be a precaution, not a provocation. For several weeks, life aboard the Maine was routine. The sailors carried out maintenance work. They wrote letters home. They watched the busy harbor from the deck. most likely assumed their stay in Havana would pass quietly. Then came the night of February 15th. Just before midnight, an enormous explosion ripped through the ship. Without warning, more than 5 tons of gunpowder detonated inside the Maine. The blast tore apart the forward section of the vessel. Steel plates twisted outward. Decks collapsed. Fire and debris shot into the night sky. Within seconds, a third of the ship had been obliterated. Many of the crew had been asleep when the explosion struck. Those who survived the initial blast were thrown into darkness, smoke, and chaos as the shattered ship began to sink into the harbor. Nearby vessels rushed to help. Rescue boats scrambled across the water searching for survivors, but the damage was catastrophic. In the end, 260 sailors lost their lives. The sinking of the USS Maine stunned the United States. Almost immediately, the question on everyone's mind was the same. What caused the explosion? There were only 2 real possibilities. The first was an accident. Coal bunkers aboard ships could sometimes ignite under certain conditions, creating fires that might trigger nearby ammunition magazines. If that had happened on the Maine, the tragedy would be terrible, but not an act of war. The second possibility was far more dangerous. If an external explosion, such as a naval mine, had triggered the blast, then Spain could be responsible. And if Spain had attacked an American warship, war would be inevitable. President McKinley urged patience. Investigations were launched. Naval engineers began examining the wreckage. Experts debated possible explanations. But while officials searched for answers, American newspapers were already delivering their own conclusions. Across the country, headlines exploded with outrage. "Remember the Maine" became a rallying cry. Editorials demanded justice, and millions of Americans began to believe that Spain had attacked their country without warning. Whether the evidence supported that claim or not, the momentum toward war had already begun. In the weeks following the destruction of the USS Maine, the United States found itself caught in a storm of public outrage. Across the country, newspaper headlines screamed accusations against Spain. Illustrations showed the American battleship ripped apart by an enemy mine. Editorial writers demanded revenge. And everywhere, one phrase echoed through the streets, newspapers, and political speeches. "Remember the Maine, to hell with Spain." President William McKinley, however, was not eager to rush into war. He had seen war before. As a young soldier in the American Civil War, McKinley understood the cost of conflict far better than most politicians calling for it. For weeks, he urged restraint. Investigations were still underway. The truth behind the explosion had not yet been proven, but public pressure was building rapidly. American sympathy for Cuba's independence movement had already been growing for years. Now the loss of 260 American sailors had transformed the debate from foreign policy into national outrage. In March of 1898, the official American naval investigation delivered its findings. According to the report, the USS Maine had most likely been destroyed by an external explosion, probably a naval mine placed beneath the ship. Spain strongly denied the accusation. Spanish investigators had reached a completely different conclusion. Their report argued that the explosion had been caused by an internal accident, likely involving the ship's coal storage. But by this point, the damage to diplomacy had already been done. The American public overwhelmingly believed Spain was responsible, and political pressure on Washington continued to intensify. Meanwhile, tensions between the two nations were rising across the Atlantic as well. Spain's government understood that a war with the United States would be incredibly dangerous. Spain's navy was outdated compared to the rapidly modernizing American fleet. Its economy was struggling, and its military forces were already stretched thin across multiple colonies. But Spanish leaders also faced a political nightmare of their own. Surrendering Cuba without a fight could trigger outrage back home. Many in the Spanish monarchy feared that giving in to American demands would spark a revolution within Spain itself. So both nations found themselves trapped by circumstances. The United States was under enormous pressure from its citizens to act. Spain feared that backing down would destroy its government. Diplomatic negotiations continued for several tense weeks, but the situation reached its breaking point in April of 1898. The United States Congress passed a resolution demanding that Spain withdraw completely from Cuba. Attached to the resolution was something known as the Teller Amendment. This amendment promised that the United States had no intention of annexing Cuba after the war. America, Congress declared, would fight only to secure Cuban independence. Spain rejected the ultimatum. Diplomatic relations between the two countries collapsed almost immediately. Soon after, the United States Navy established a blockade around Cuba, cutting off Spanish ships from entering or leaving the island. The message was unmistakable. War had effectively already begun. Then, on April 23, 1898, Spain made the first official move. The Spanish government formally declared war on the United States. 2 days later, the United States responded with its own declaration. After months of rising tension, political pressure, and public outrage, the Spanish-American War had begun. But the first major battle would not take place in Cuba. Instead, the opening shots of the war would erupt on the other side of the world, in a distant Spanish colony in the Pacific Ocean, the Philippines. When war between the United States and Spain officially began in April of 1898, American military planners already had a bold strategy in mind. If Spain was going to fight to defend its empire, the United States would strike at that empire everywhere it existed, not just in the Caribbean, but across the globe. Thousands of miles away in the Pacific Ocean, Spain controlled another massive colony, the Philippine Islands. For centuries, the Philippines had been a critical outpost of Spanish trade and influence in Asia. But like Cuba, the islands had also been simmering with rebellion. A Filipino independence movement had already been fighting Spanish rule for years. American leaders realized something important. If the Spanish fleet stationed in the Philippines could be destroyed quickly, Spain would lose control of the Pacific before the war had even truly begun. And the man chosen to carry out that mission was Commodore George Dewey. Dewey commanded the United States Navy's Asiatic Squadron, a fleet of modern warships stationed in Hong Kong. As soon as war was declared, Dewey received his orders: sail to the Philippines, find the Spanish fleet, destroy it. Dewey wasted no time. Within hours of receiving the news, his ships were already steaming toward Manila Bay. The Spanish commander in the Philippines, Admiral Patricio Montojo, knew the Americans were coming, but his situation was grim. Most of his ships were outdated. Some were built from wood instead of steel. Others were poorly maintained and barely seaworthy. One of his cruisers had even sprung a serious leak shortly before the battle. Despite these disadvantages, Montojo positioned his fleet inside Manila Bay, hoping that coastal defenses and naval mines might slow the American advance. But Dewey had something Spain did not expect: intelligence. American agents had gathered detailed information about Spanish defensive positions inside the bay. Armed with that knowledge, Dewey made a daring decision. Instead of waiting for daylight, he would sail directly into Manila Bay under the cover of darkness. Late on the night of April 30th, 1898, Dewey's squadron quietly approached the entrance to the harbor. The ships moved slowly and carefully through the narrow passage. At any moment, naval mines could detonate. Spanish shore batteries could open fire. But incredibly, nothing happened. The American fleet slipped past the defenses almost unnoticed. By dawn, the United States Navy was already inside the harbor. The Spanish fleet lay directly ahead. At 5:41 in the morning, Commodore Dewey turned to the captain of the USS Olympia and calmly delivered a line that would become legendary in naval history. "You may fire when ready, Gridley." Moments later, the American fleet opened fire. The battle that followed was devastating. Dewey's ships were modern steel cruisers armed with powerful naval guns. The Spanish vessels facing them were slower, weaker, and poorly equipped. The American ships sailed past the Spanish line again and again, firing devastating broadsides as they passed. Spanish ships erupted in flames. Explosions tore through their decks. Crews scrambled desperately to control the damage. Admiral Montojo attempted a desperate counterattack, ordering some ships to ram the American fleet, but the effort was hopeless. American gunfire shredded the advancing vessels before they could even get close. Within hours, the Spanish fleet was in ruins. Ships burned across the harbor. Others were intentionally scuttled by their own crews to avoid capture. When the smoke finally cleared, Spain's Pacific Fleet had been completely destroyed. And astonishingly, the United States had suffered almost no losses at all. The war was only days old, and already Spain's empire was collapsing. The Battle of Manila Bay was more than just a naval victory. It was a shockwave that rippled across the world. In a single morning, the United States had destroyed Spain's entire Pacific Fleet. For Spain, it was a devastating blow, not just militarily but psychologically. For centuries, Spain had ruled a vast overseas empire. Now, in a matter of hours, one of its major colonial defenses had simply vanished. Yet Commodore George Dewey understood something important. Winning the naval battle did not mean the Philippines had been conquered. Manila, the colonial capital, was still firmly in Spanish hands, and Dewey didn't have nearly enough soldiers to capture it. His ships controlled the harbor, but beyond the coastline stood thousands of Spanish troops dug into defensive positions around the city. So Dewey made a careful decision. He would wait. Reinforcements were requested from the United States, and until they arrived, Dewey would maintain control of the bay while watching events unfold on land. But there was another force already fighting Spain in the Philippines, a revolutionary movement, and its leader was a man named Emilio Aguinaldo. Aguinaldo had been one of the most important leaders of the Philippine independence movement. For years, Filipino revolutionaries had been battling Spanish colonial rule across the islands. But after earlier setbacks, Aguinaldo had been forced into exile in Hong Kong. Now, with Spain suddenly at war with the United States, Dewey saw an opportunity. American officials arranged for Aguinaldo to return to the Philippines. The idea was simple. If Filipino revolutionaries resumed their rebellion against Spain, they would tie down Spanish troops on land while the Americans secured control of Manila. In May of 1898, Aguinaldo returned to the Philippines. The effect was explosive. Across the islands, Filipino revolutionaries rallied once again. Villages rose up. Spanish garrisons were attacked. Rebel forces rapidly spread across the countryside. Within weeks, most of the Philippines had slipped out of Spanish control. Only a few fortified strongholds remained under Spanish authority, and the most important of them all was Manila itself. Spanish troops retreated behind the massive stone walls of a district known as Intramuros, the historic walled city at the heart of Manila. Inside those walls, the Spanish Governor-General, Fermin Jaudenes, prepared for what seemed inevitable, a siege. Meanwhile, Aguinaldo's forces surrounded the city from the outside. By the summer of 1898, Spanish authority in the Philippines had essentially collapsed everywhere except the capital. But something strange was about to happen, because while Filipino revolutionaries believed they were on the brink of independence, negotiations were quietly unfolding behind the scenes. American and Spanish commanders had begun discussing a highly unusual plan. Neither side wanted Manila to fall directly into the hands of the Filipino revolutionaries. Spain feared the chaos that might follow, and American officials had begun considering a future where the United States, not the Philippines, controlled the islands. So instead of a chaotic battle, they agreed on something extraordinary, a staged surrender. A brief, controlled battle would take place between American and Spanish forces. Spain would appear to resist. The United States would appear to win, and control of Manila would quietly pass from Spain directly to the United States. The Filipino revolutionaries surrounding the city were not told about this plan, and when the battle finally began in August of 1898, things would not unfold exactly as anyone expected. On the morning of August 13, 1898, the plan went into motion. American warships positioned in Manila Bay opened fire toward the Spanish defenses surrounding the city, but the bombardment was carefully controlled. Naval guns aimed mostly toward open ground and hillsides rather than directly at buildings. Spanish artillery responded, but many of their shells were intentionally fired wide. From the outside, it looked like a real battle. In reality, both sides already knew how the day would end. Spanish troops slowly retreated from their outer defenses. American soldiers advanced toward the city, exchanging scattered fire along the way. Everything was unfolding according to the agreement. Then the unexpected happened. When Spanish forces raised a white flag signaling surrender, Filipino revolutionary troops watching from nearby positions saw their opportunity. For months, Aguinaldo's fighters had been battling Spanish forces across the islands. They believed Manila's fall would finally secure the independence they had fought so hard to achieve. So when they saw the Spanish surrender beginning, they rushed forward to join the fight, but they had no idea the battle was supposed to be staged. As Filipino troops advanced toward the city, Spanish soldiers, confused and fearing the collapse of the carefully arranged surrender, began firing real shots. American officers quickly moved to block Aguinaldo's forces from entering the city. Tensions rose rapidly. For a brief moment, the carefully choreographed surrender nearly turned into a chaotic three-sided battle. Eventually, Filipino forces were convinced to withdraw. The surrender proceeded as planned. Manila passed directly from Spanish control into American hands. Spain's empire in the Philippines had effectively come to an end. But for Filipino revolutionaries, the victory felt hollow. They had fought Spain for years. They had expected independence. Instead, a new power had taken control of the capital, and they had been excluded from the negotiations that decided their country's fate. While tensions simmered in the Pacific, the main focus of the war was unfolding thousands of miles away in the Caribbean. Because the United States had not entered the conflict only to strike Spain's Pacific possessions, the primary objective remained Cuba. By the summer of 1898, American forces were preparing to land on the island and support the Cuban revolutionaries who had been fighting Spain for years. For many Cubans, the arrival of American troops brought hope. Spain's army still controlled major cities across the island. But with American military power now entering the war, victory suddenly seemed closer than ever. American military planners outlined three main goals for the campaign in Cuba. First, seize a secure coastal position where troops and supplies could land. Second, defeat the Spanish army defending the island. And third, destroy the Spanish naval fleet stationed in the Caribbean. If those objectives could be accomplished, Spain's position in the Americas would collapse. In June of 1898, American warships approached the southeastern coast of Cuba. Their destination was a natural harbor that would soon become one of the most famous American military bases in the world, Guantanamo Bay. Spanish gunboats guarding the area initially tried to challenge the approaching fleet, but when they saw the size and firepower of the American ships, they quickly retreated. Moments later, American naval guns began pounding the coastal defenses. Within hours, Spanish artillery positions were destroyed, and soon after, hundreds of U.S. Marines began landing on Cuban soil. For the first time in the war, American and Spanish soldiers were about to meet each other in combat. The landing at Guantanamo Bay in June of 1898 marked the beginning of America's ground war in Cuba. Under the blazing Caribbean sun, hundreds of United States Marines moved ashore, hauling crates of ammunition, artillery pieces, and heavy equipment across rough terrain. Their objective was simple: establish a secure base of operations from which American forces could push deeper into Spanish-controlled territory. The Marines quickly set up a defensive camp near the landing site, a position that became known as Camp McCalla. Surprisingly, the landing itself faced almost no resistance. Spanish troops had been spotted in the distance, watching from the surrounding hills and forests, but they did not attack. At first, American commanders found this strange, but the explanation would soon become clear. Spanish and Loyalist Cuban forces nearby were running dangerously low on food and supplies. They had a plan. Instead of attacking immediately, they would wait. They would let the Americans unload their supplies first. Then they would strike and try to seize the food for themselves. And so, before dawn on June 11th, Spanish guerrilla fighters launched their attack. Gunfire suddenly erupted around Camp McCalla. Bullets tore through the darkness as Spanish troops advanced through thick jungle vegetation toward the Marine camp. Caught off guard, American soldiers scrambled for cover. At this early stage, the Marines had not yet had time to dig proper defensive trenches. Many were forced to fire from behind trees, rocks, or supply crates as the battle erupted around them. The Spanish fighters had another advantage. They had woven palm leaves into their uniforms, blending perfectly with the dense tropical environment. Even worse for the Marines, Spanish soldiers were using smokeless powder ammunition. Unlike older gunpowder weapons that produced clouds of smoke with every shot, these rifles revealed almost nothing about their location. American soldiers could hear the gunfire, but often they couldn't see where it was coming from. Still, the Marines had weapons of their own that would soon turn the tide. Among their equipment were several newly issued machine guns, the Colt Browning 1895. These early machine guns, though primitive by modern standards, could unleash a devastating stream of bullets across the battlefield. As the Spanish fighters advanced, the Marines opened fire. The machine guns roared to life. Their rapid bursts cut through the jungle, forcing the attackers to slow their advance. Meanwhile, American naval ships anchored offshore joined the fight. Gunboats fired shells into suspected Spanish positions along the hills surrounding the camp. The combined firepower of machine guns and naval artillery made it impossible for the Spanish forces to overrun the Marines. But the fighting did not end quickly. For several days, skirmishes continued around the camp. Sleep became almost impossible. Some Marines later reported going more than 100 hours without proper rest, constantly on edge as gunfire erupted in the jungle around them. Eventually, reinforcements arrived. Cuban revolutionary fighters joined the Americans, providing valuable knowledge of the terrain and the locations of nearby Spanish forces. Together, they prepared for their next objective. Just a few miles away stood the Cusco Well, the only reliable fresh water source in the area. If the Americans and their Cuban allies wanted to maintain control of Guantanamo Bay, they would have to capture it. The march toward the Cusco Well began under a scorching Cuban sun. For the American Marines and their Cuban allies, water had become a serious concern. The rugged terrain around Guantanamo Bay offered little relief from the heat, and without control of the well, their newly established base would struggle to survive. But Spanish commanders understood the importance of the position just as well. Roughly 500 Spanish soldiers had fortified the hill overlooking the well, preparing to defend it against any advance. As the American and Cuban forces approached, the sound of rifle fire suddenly echoed across the hillside. The Spanish had opened fire. Their Mauser rifles, modern bolt-action weapons, cracked sharply through the air. American troops immediately felt the difference. Unlike many U.S. soldiers still using older black powder rifles, Spanish troops were equipped with smokeless powder ammunition and faster-loading weapons. They could fire multiple shots in the time it took some Americans to reload. Bullets tore through the brush as the advancing forces scrambled for cover. But the Americans had advantages of their own. Supporting the attack from offshore was the USS Dolphin, a U.S. Navy gunboat positioned along the coast. As the battle intensified, the the Dolphin began firing shells toward Spanish defensive positions on the hill. Explosions rocked the landscape as artillery pounded enemy fortifications. Meanwhile, Cuban and American fighters began climbing the hill from two separate directions, slowly tightening the pressure on the Spanish defenders. The climb was brutal, the heat was relentless, and every step forward exposed the attackers to deadly rifle fire from above. At one point during the battle, a dangerous mistake nearly turned the situation into a disaster. As American troops advanced toward a Spanish strongpoint, the USS Dolphin attempted to adjust its artillery fire to assist the assault. But something went wrong. Instead of hitting Spanish positions, several shells began landing dangerously close to the advancing Marines. The explosions blocked their path forward and left them exposed to enemy fire. If the naval bombardment continued like this, the advancing troops could be caught in a deadly crossfire. Then, in one of the most extraordinary moments of the battle, a Marine named Sergeant John Quick stepped forward. Realizing someone had to signal the gunboat to shift its aim, Quick grabbed a long stick and tied a blue handkerchief to the end, creating a makeshift signal flag. Then he did something few soldiers would dare. He walked out into the open. Standing upright on the ridge, completely exposed to enemy fire, Quick began signaling the USS Dolphin using flag movements to direct the ship's gunners. Rifles cracked around him. Bullets snapped through the air. Yet Quick remained calm, continuing to wave the signal flag with deliberate movements. Observers later recalled that he appeared completely focused on his task, ignoring the chaos unfolding around him. Incredibly, he was not hit. The signal reached the gunboat. Moments later, the Dolphin corrected its aim. Artillery shells began striking the Spanish strongpoint directly. With the bombardment now properly aligned, Cuban and American forces surged forward. The Spanish defenders, realizing their position had become untenable, withdrew from the hill. The Cusco well had been captured. The victory secured the water supply for the American base at Guantanamo Bay, and Sergeant John Quick would later receive the Medal of Honor for his bravery that day. But this was only the beginning, because the main objective of the Cuban campaign still lay ahead: the heavily defended Spanish stronghold of Santiago. By late June of 1898, American and Cuban forces had begun moving west from Guantanamo Bay toward the Spanish stronghold of Santiago de Cuba. Santiago was one of the most important cities on the island. It served as a major port, a transportation hub, and a key defensive position for Spanish forces in eastern Cuba. If Santiago fell, Spain's ability to hold the island would collapse, but getting there would not be easy. Spanish troops had dug in along the narrow jungle roads leading toward the city, preparing defensive positions to slow the American advance. On June 24th, American scouts spotted Spanish forces ahead near a small village known as Las Guasimas. Reports suggested that roughly 1,000 Spanish soldiers were occupying defensive positions in the area. American commanders now faced a decision. Some scouts, particularly Cuban fighters familiar with the terrain, believed the Spanish troops were already preparing to retreat toward Santiago, but other reports indicated they were digging trenches and setting up artillery. Major General Joseph Wheeler, a veteran officer who had once fought for the Confederacy during the American Civil War, chose to trust the American reports. He ordered an immediate attack. American cavalry units advanced toward the Spanish positions, expecting to push them out of the village. But the Spanish soldiers were ready. As the Americans moved forward, rifle fire suddenly erupted from concealed positions along the road. Spanish troops had taken cover behind thick vegetation and defensive lines, using the terrain to their advantage. The American attack quickly stalled. The soldiers pushing forward were exposed to a steady barrage of gunfire, forcing them to retreat and regroup. After a brief pause, Wheeler ordered a second assault. Again, American troops advanced toward the village, and again, they were met with heavy resistance. The fighting lasted several hours as both sides exchanged fire across the dense jungle landscape. Eventually, Spanish troops began pulling back towards Santiago. American commanders interpreted this withdrawal as a victory, but in reality, the Cuban scouts had been correct all along. The Spanish forces had never intended to hold the position permanently. Their orders had been to delay the American advance while they withdrew towards stronger defensive positions closer to the city. In that sense, the Spanish mission had succeeded. They had slowed the American advance while suffering relatively few losses. Meanwhile, American forces had taken significantly higher casualties during the attack. Despite that, newspapers back in the United States quickly reported the Battle of Las Guasimas as a major American victory. Stories praising the courage of American soldiers filled the headlines. And perhaps most importantly, the engagement boosted morale among the troops marching towards Santiago. Reinforcements continued to arrive. Thousands of additional soldiers poured into Cuba, including volunteer cavalry units that would soon become famous across the United States. Among them was a regiment known as the Rough Riders. The Rough Riders were a unique group. They were a volunteer cavalry unit made up of cowboys, miners, college athletes, and adventurers from across the country. And among their leaders was a man whose name would soon become legendary in American politics, Theodore Roosevelt. Within days, these volunteers would find themselves charging directly into one of the most famous battles of the entire war, a fight for control of two strategic hills just outside Santiago, San Juan Hill and Kettle Hill. By the end of June 1898, the road to Santiago was narrowing. American and Cuban forces had marched for days through thick jungle, suffocating heat, and relentless exhaustion. Ahead of them lay the final defensive ring protecting the city. Spanish commanders had chosen their ground carefully. Two fortified positions dominated the landscape outside Santiago, the town of El Caney, and a steep ridge crowned by trenches and artillery known as San Juan Hill. If American forces could break through these defenses, Santiago itself would be exposed. The plan seemed straightforward. On July 1st, 1898, American troops would launch two coordinated assaults. One force would attack El Caney, where roughly 500 Spanish soldiers defended the town. The second and much larger force would storm San Juan Hill and nearby Kettle Hill. The two battles were meant to support each other. Once El Caney fell, those troops would march south to reinforce the assault on San Juan Hill. On paper, the numbers favored the Americans heavily. More than 15,000 American and Cuban troops were advancing. At El Caney, nearly 6,000 Americans would face only a few hundred Spanish defenders. Many officers believed the battle would be over quickly. They were wrong. As the attack began that morning, American soldiers quickly discovered how formidable the Spanish defenses really were. Spanish troops were equipped with modern Mauser rifles, fast, accurate, bolt-action weapons firing smokeless cartridges. American infantry, by contrast, still carried a mix of older rifles, some of which used black powder that created visible clouds of smoke with every shot. That difference proved deadly. As American troops advanced toward El Caney, Spanish soldiers fired rapid, precise volleys from fortified positions. Bullets rained down across open fields. American soldiers struggled to push forward under the relentless fire. What had been expected to be a quick victory turned into a brutal 12-hour battle. Wave after wave of American infantry attacked the town. Slowly, building by building, they forced the Spanish defenders back. But the cost was staggering. By the time El Caney finally fell late that afternoon, more than 1,000 American soldiers had been killed or wounded. The Spanish defenders, meanwhile, had accomplished their mission. Though they were eventually forced to retreat, they had delayed thousands of American troops for the entire day, preventing them from reinforcing the attack on San Juan Hill. And while that brutal fight raged in El Caney, another legendary battle was unfolding just a few miles away. At the base of San Juan Hill, More than 8,000 American soldiers were preparing for one of the most famous charges in military history. Among them were several regiments of Buffalo Soldiers, African American cavalry units, who had already proven themselves as some of the most disciplined and effective troops in the U.S. Army. And alongside them stood the Rough Riders. Despite being officially a cavalry regiment, most of Roosevelt's Rough Riders were fighting on foot. There simply weren't enough horses for everyone. But that didn't matter, because soon, under a blazing tropical sun and a storm of Spanish gunfire, these soldiers would begin the climb that would define the entire war. At the base of San Juan Hill, thousands of American soldiers waited under the punishing Cuban sun. The terrain ahead of them was unforgiving. Open fields stretched toward a steep ridge where Spanish troops had built trenches, artillery positions, and defensive barricades. From the top of the hill, Spanish soldiers had a clear view of the battlefield below. Anyone attempting to advance would be fully exposed. Yet the order to attack had already been given. Among the troops preparing for the assault were units of the U.S. Army's Buffalo Soldiers, veteran African American regiments who had fought in numerous frontier campaigns across the American West. Alongside them stood Theodore Roosevelt's Rough Riders. Despite the famous name, most of Roosevelt's men were not mounted cavalry during the battle. With limited horses available, they would be charging uphill on foot, just like the infantry around them. Before the advance began, American commanders deployed a powerful new weapon onto the battlefield: Gatling guns. These early machine guns were mounted on wheeled carriages and operated by hand cranks. When the crank turned, the weapon unleashed a stream of bullets far faster than any single rifleman could fire. 3 Gatling guns were positioned to provide covering fire for the advancing troops. When the assault began, those guns roared to life. The rapid bursts echoed across the battlefield, sending thousands of rounds toward the Spanish trenches. Under that cover, American soldiers began moving forward. The first stage of the advance brought them to the base of the hills. From there, they faced the most dangerous part of the attack, the climb. As soon as the soldiers began moving up the slopes, Spanish rifles opened fire. Bullets ripped through the tall grass. Men fell as they tried to scramble uphill. For a moment, the assault seemed to stall under the deadly resistance. Then Theodore Roosevelt decided to act. Roosevelt had already built a reputation as a bold and energetic leader. That morning, he believed hesitation could cost the battle. So he did something dramatic. Mounting his horse, Roosevelt rode to the front of the line, revolver in hand. According to several accounts, he shouted to his men that they'd better not leave him charging up the hill alone, or he'd shoot them himself. Whether joking or serious, the message worked. The Rough Riders surged forward. Alongside them, Buffalo Soldier regiments joined the advance, pushing upward through gunfire toward the Spanish positions. The charge became chaotic. Units mixed together. Officers struggled to maintain formation, but the momentum kept building. Within 20 minutes, American forces reached the crest of nearby Kettle Hill, a key position overlooking San Juan Hill itself. The Spanish defenders were forced to retreat from the position under the pressure of the assault. From the top of Kettle Hill, American troops could now fire directly into Spanish defenses on San Juan Hill. Soon afterward, the rest of the American assault finally reached the top of the main ridge. Spanish forces, realizing their defensive line had collapsed, attempted a counterattack. Hundreds of Spanish soldiers rushed forward in a desperate effort to retake the position, but they were met with devastating fire from Gatling guns that had been dragged to the top of the hill. Within moments, the counterattack collapsed. By the end of the day, American forces held both San Juan Hill and Kettle Hill. It was one of the most famous victories of the war, but it had come at a heavy cost. More than 1,000 American soldiers had been killed or wounded during the battle, and the war itself was not yet over, because while American troops now overlooked the city of Santiago, a powerful Spanish fleet still waited inside the harbor below. With San Juan Hill and Kettle Hill now in American hands, The city of Santiago lay directly below the victorious troops. From the ridges overlooking the city, American artillery and rifle fire could now reach Spanish positions inside the defensive perimeter. Spanish soldiers still held the city itself, but their situation was rapidly becoming desperate. The American army surrounded Santiago from the land. Cuban revolutionary fighters controlled the surrounding countryside, and just offshore, the United States Navy had sealed off the harbor. Inside that harbor sat Spain's last major naval force in the Caribbean, the Spanish Caribbean Squadron. For weeks, those ships had been trapped inside Santiago Bay, unable to escape the American blockade waiting outside. The Spanish commander, Admiral Pascual Cervera, knew his fleet could not remain trapped forever. Supplies inside the city were running low. American artillery was closing in. If the fleet stayed in harbor much longer, it risked being destroyed where it sat. So Cervera made a decision. He would attempt a breakout. On the morning of July 3, 1898, American ships patrolling the waters outside Santiago noticed something unusual. Smoke rising from inside the harbor. Moments later, the first Spanish cruiser burst through the narrow entrance and raced toward the open sea. One by one, 6 Spanish warships followed. Their mission was simple: break through the American blockade, escape into the Atlantic, and save what remained of Spain's naval power in the Caribbean. But the American fleet was ready. The moment the Spanish ships appeared, U.S. warships turned to intercept them. What followed was one of the most one-sided naval battles in modern history. The leading Spanish cruiser, the Infanta Maria Teresa, immediately came under heavy fire from American battleships. Shells slammed into its hull. Flames spread across the deck. Within minutes, the ship was burning so badly that the crew was forced to run it aground along the coastline to escape the inferno. Behind it, the cruiser Almirante Oquendo attempted to break through the American line, but it too was hammered by heavy gunfire. The ship suffered multiple explosions inside its hull before eventually running aground as well. Further along the coast, the cruiser Vizcaya attempted to outrun the American fleet. For nearly an hour, it exchanged fire with American ships racing alongside it. But the result was the same. American shells battered the Spanish cruiser until it was forced to beach itself along the shoreline. The remaining Spanish vessels faced similar fates: outgunned, outmaneuvered, and unable to escape the relentless firepower of the American Navy. By the end of the battle, every ship in the Spanish Caribbean Squadron had been destroyed. More than 300 Spanish sailors had been killed. Nearly 1,800 were captured after being rescued from the burning wrecks. Meanwhile, the United States Navy suffered almost no losses at all. Just one sailor was killed during the entire battle. Spain's naval power in the Caribbean had been wiped out in a single morning, and with the fleet destroyed, Santiago had no hope of rescue. Within days, American forces began tightening the siege around the city. Spanish troops inside the city knew the end was coming, and soon, negotiations for surrender would begin. With the Spanish fleet destroyed outside Santiago Harbor, the fate of the city was essentially sealed. American forces now controlled the hills surrounding Santiago. From those positions, artillery batteries began firing into Spanish defenses inside the city. Meanwhile, Cuban revolutionary fighters cut off supply routes, preventing food, ammunition, and reinforcements from reaching the trapped Spanish garrison. Inside Santiago, conditions quickly began to deteriorate. Thousands of Spanish soldiers crowded into defensive positions as shells exploded across the city. Food supplies dwindled. Medical facilities were overwhelmed, and the tropical heat made everything worse. But the Spanish commander inside the city, General Arsenio Linares, later replaced by General José Toro, understood something important. Even though the situation looked hopeless, surrender was not a simple decision. Spanish officers had been ordered to defend their colonies at all costs. To surrender too quickly might bring accusations of dishonor once they returned to Spain. Still, the reality of the battlefield could not be ignored. The American army surrounded the city. The Spanish Navy had been annihilated, and thousands of soldiers were already sick, wounded, or exhausted. American forces, meanwhile, were preparing for a full assault if negotiations failed. The fighting around Santiago had already taken a terrible toll on both sides. But ironically, the greatest threat to the American army wasn't Spanish bullets. It was disease. The tropical environment of Cuba proved brutal for the invading troops. Yellow fever, malaria, dysentery, and other illnesses spread rapidly through crowded military camps. Doctors struggled to treat the growing number of sick soldiers. Some units reported more men incapacitated by disease than by combat. Even Theodore Roosevelt himself became seriously ill during the campaign. Military leaders began worrying that if the war dragged on too long, the army could lose thousands more soldiers to sickness. Under these conditions, pressure grew on both sides to end the siege quickly. On July 17, 1898, negotiations finally reached a conclusion. General José Toral agreed to surrender the city of Santiago and all Spanish forces in eastern Cuba. The following day, Spanish troops marched out of the city and laid down their arms. American and Cuban forces entered Santiago soon afterward. One of Spain's most important colonial strongholds in the Caribbean had fallen. Across the United States, celebrations erupted. Newspapers declared the victory a turning point in the war. For many Americans, it seemed like the conflict might already be nearing its end. But while Santiago's fall was a massive victory, the war itself was still spreading. Because there was another Spanish colony in the Caribbean that American leaders were determined to capture: Puerto Rico. In fact, American naval ships had already been attacking Puerto Rican ports throughout June. But now, with Spanish forces collapsing in Cuba, the United States prepared to launch a full-scale invasion of the island. President McKinley approved the operation in late July of 1898. Within days, American soldiers began landing along the southern coast of Puerto Rico. They expected a quick victory, but Puerto Rico would prove to be a far more complicated battlefield than many American commanders had anticipated. By the summer of 1898, the Spanish-American War was already nearing its end. What had begun as a colonial uprising in Cuba had transformed into a global conflict that reshaped the balance of power in the world. Spain, once the ruler of an empire that stretched across oceans, had suffered devastating defeats in the Caribbean and the Pacific. Its navy had been shattered, its colonies were slipping away, and its government now faced an unavoidable truth: the war could not be won. On August 12, 1898, Spain and the United States signed what was known as the Protocol of Peace. Hostilities officially ended that day, but the final terms of the war still had to be negotiated. Several months later, representatives from both nations met in Paris to decide the fate of Spain's remaining overseas territories. The result was the Treaty of Paris, signed in December of 1898. The agreement reshaped the map of the world. Spain formally relinquished control of Cuba, ending more than 4 centuries of Spanish rule in the Americas. Puerto Rico and the island of Guam were transferred to the United States. And perhaps most significantly of all, Spain agreed to sell the Philippines to the United States for $20 million. For Spain, the treaty marked the collapse of one of the greatest empires in history. For the United States, it marked something entirely different: a beginning. Almost overnight, America had transformed from a continental nation into a global power. With territories in the Caribbean and the Pacific, the United States suddenly possessed strategic footholds across 2 oceans. American ships could now move more easily between hemispheres. Trade routes expanded, and the country began stepping onto the world stage in a way it never had before. But the consequences of the war were not entirely triumphant. Cuba, the original battleground of the conflict, would gain formal independence in 1902. Yet the United States maintained enormous influence over the island's politics and foreign affairs for decades. Puerto Rico became a permanent U.S. territory. Guam transformed into a strategic naval outpost in the Pacific. And in the Philippines, the story would take a darker turn. Filipino revolutionaries who had fought Spain expecting independence now found themselves under American control instead. When it became clear that independence would not come, tensions exploded into a new and far bloodier conflict, the Philippine-American War. That war would last for years and cost hundreds of thousands of lives. It forced Americans to confront a difficult question. Had the United States truly fought against colonialism, or had it simply replaced one empire with another? Even during the war itself, critics like the famous writer Mark Twain accused the United States of hypocrisy. After all, America had been born from a revolution against imperial rule, yet now it controlled territories thousands of miles beyond its shores. More than a century later, historians still debate the true meaning of the Spanish-American War. Was it a war for freedom, a war for influence, or the moment the United States began its rise as a global superpower? Perhaps, in reality, it was all three, because in just 4 short months, the war did something extraordinary. It ended the last great European empire in the Americas. It ignited new struggles for independence across the world, and it marked the moment when the United States stepped out of its own shadow and onto the stage of global power.